the story of the Gordians' father and son who ruled Rome together for just a few weeks in 238 CE, is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of the Roman Empire, for it reveals both the fragility of imperial power during the crisis of the 3rd century and the desperate search for legitimacy in an age of chaos. Gordian I, born Marcus Antonius Gordianus Sempronianus Romanus in 158 CE, was a member of Rome's senatorial aristocracy, wealthy, cultured, and respected for his distinguished service as a governor and his literary accomplishments. Unlike Maximinus Thrax, who embodied the soldier-emperor ideal of brute strength and battlefield loyalty, Gordian I represented the traditional values of Rome's ruling elite: refinement, education, wealth, and senatorial dignity. His son, Gordian II, shared in his father's prestige, though his fame derived more from his family name than from personal accomplishments. For he was relatively young, still inexperienced, and carried upward by the sudden opportunity to rule. The two Gordians came to power not through the army's acclamation, nor through dynastic succession, but through a revolt in Africa Proconsularis, sparked by outrage at the heavy taxation and confiscations imposed by Maximinus Thrax. The local landowners, suffocated by the emperor's greed and alienated by his disdain for senatorial culture, sought a figure who could embody their resistance. Gordian I, serving as proconsul in Africa, was their natural choice. He was wealthy, respected, and carried the aura of legitimacy through his senatorial rank and advanced age. When the African elites declared rebellion against Maximinus and acclaimed Gordian I as emperor, the old man at first resisted, aware of the dangers of challenging a sitting emperor whose soldiers still commanded fear across the empire. Yet the tide of events swept him along. Gordian I accepted, and in a gesture meant to strengthen his claim, he elevated his son Gordian II as co-emperor, thereby creating a dynastic partnership that linked senatorial dignity with youthful continuity. For a brief, shining moment, the Gordians seemed to offer Rome the return of the old ideals, a restoration of aristocratic leadership against the barbaric tyranny of Maximinus. Their proclamation was met with jubilation in Rome itself, where the Senate, long humiliated by the soldier emperors, seized the chance to assert its power. The senators declared Maximinus a public enemy and recognized the Gordians as legitimate rulers, an extraordinary act of defiance that exposed the depth of hatred against the Thracian giant. Statues were raised, coins were minted, and messages of loyalty flooded from the capital, all declaring that Gordian I and Gordian II were the saviors of Rome, men who would return power to its rightful class. Yet this optimism was short-lived, for even as the Senate rejoiced, even as the people of Rome celebrated, events in Africa unfolded with tragic swiftness. The province was not entirely united in rebellion, and the governor of Numidia, loyal to Maximinus, commanded a legion of hardened soldiers, the Legio III Augusta, who remained faithful to the reigning emperor. With speed and determination, these troops marched against the Gordians. Gordian II, commanding the hastily assembled forces of local landowners and militias, met them in battle outside Carthage. The clash was unequal from the start. The legion, trained and experienced, cut down the ill-prepared rebels. Gordian II was slain in the fighting, his young life extinguished in a single desperate day. The news of his son's death shattered Gordian I, stricken by grief, crushed by despair, and recognizing that all was lost. The old man took his own life, ending his reign after only 22 days. Thus, in less than a month, the hopes of senatorial restoration collapsed in blood and tragedy. The Senate, upon hearing the news, was horrified, for now they stood exposed, declared enemies of Maximinus, with no emperors left to protect them. Yet the Gordians' brief rule was not without consequence, for their names carried weight, their memory evoked sympathy, and their family line still offered hope. A grandson of Gordian I, Gordian III, would in time be elevated as emperor, a child through whom the Senate and people could channel their yearning for stability. The Gordians, though defeated, left a legacy larger than their reign. They embodied the Senate's final, desperate effort to reclaim authority in the imperial system, an effort doomed by the military realities of the 3rd century, but forever remembered as a moment when aristocratic dignity stood against brute force. Their story, tragic and fleeting, reveals how the crisis of the 3rd century was not merely a military struggle, but a contest of values, between tradition and change, between culture and power, between the Senate and the legions. And though they fell swiftly, their memory endured as symbols of resistance, martyrs to the cause of senatorial Rome in an age when emperors were made and unmade by the sword. The death of Gordian II on the battlefield outside Carthage, and the subsequent suicide of Gordian I cast a shadow over the Roman world. But the story of their brief reign did not end with their tragic deaths, for their fall set in motion a chain of events that reverberated across the empire and further destabilized Rome during the turbulent year known as the Year of the 6 Emperors. In understanding this second phase of their story, it is essential to see how their rebellion, though crushed in Africa, transformed the political landscape in Rome and deepened the chasm between the Senate and Maximinus Thrax. When the Senate learned of the Gordians' demise, the mood shifted from elation to despair, yet the senators knew that retreat was impossible. They had already declared Maximinus an enemy of the state, torn down his statues, and openly embraced the Gordians as legitimate rulers. To back down now would invite annihilation. The Senate therefore doubled down on its defiance, appointing new emperors from among its own ranks in a desperate attempt to sustain the rebellion against Maximinus. But the Gordians themselves remained central to the unfolding drama, not merely as tragic figures whose reign had ended, but as martyrs whose names carried symbolic weight. In their deaths, the Gordians became emblems of senatorial resistance, their memory used as a rallying cry against the barbarian emperor who had forced aristocrats into open war. The Senate as act of defiance following the Gordians' fall can only be understood when one appreciates the tension between Rome's governing classes and Maximinus as regime. Maximinus, as a soldier emperor, drew his legitimacy from the legions, particularly those stationed along the northern frontier, and he treated the Senate with disdain, considering them useless aristocrats who had little role in the real work of defending the empire. The Gordians, by contrast, embodied the opposite principle: rule based on wealth, education, heritage, and senatorial prestige. Their elevation had been a declaration that Rome's traditional elite still mattered, still had a role to play, and still claimed the right to make emperors. This ideological clash made reconciliation impossible once the Senate had committed to the Gordians' cause. When the father and son fell, the Senate could have sought forgiveness, perhaps suing for peace, but instead they used the memory of the Gordians to reinforce their narrative that Maximinus was a tyrant, a barbarian, an illegitimate usurper whose cruelty had driven noble Romans to their deaths. The Senate declared statues and honors for the fallen Gordians, ensuring that their names would not be erased, and began to cultivate the legend of the Gordian family as champions of aristocratic Rome. Meanwhile, the African revolt had revealed deep cracks within the imperial system. The fact that wealthy landowners in Africa were willing to risk everything by proclaiming Gordian I and Gordian II as emperors illustrates the desperation caused by Maximinus' financial policies. Heavy taxation, confiscation of estates, and extortion by imperial officials had alienated one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire. Africa Proconsularis was not merely another province. It was the breadbasket of Rome, the source of the grain that fed the capital. To have Africa in rebellion meant jeopardizing the food supply of Rome itself. This explains why the Senate reacted with such enthusiasm to the Gordians' proclamation by supporting them. The Senate hoped to secure the loyalty of Africa and its vital grain shipments, ensuring both survival and legitimacy. The swift defeat of the Gordians by the Numidian legions demonstrated, however, that without a professional army, even the wealthiest and most prestigious men could not hold the imperial throne. This lesson would be repeated again and again throughout the crisis of the 3rd century, as emperors rose and fell, depending not on senatorial approval or dynastic legitimacy, but on the loyalty of soldiers and the ability to command armies in the field. Yet, in death, the Gordians became more potent symbols than they had been in life. The Senate immediately linked their memory to its ongoing resistance, portraying them as noble men who had fallen victim to the brutality of Maximinus's regime. In Rome, the people who had celebrated their proclamation now mourned their passing, creating an atmosphere of anger and tension. The senators, fearing retribution from Maximinus, knew that they had no choice but to appoint new emperors. Thus, Papinus and Balbinus were chosen, 2 senior senators who would serve as joint emperors in the wake of the Gordians' deaths. Their appointment, however, was accompanied by the elevation of a grandson of Gordian I, the young Gordian III, as Caesar. This act was deliberate. The Senate understood that the Gordian name had become a symbol of legitimacy and popularity among the people. By associating the new emperors with the Gordian family, the Senate hoped to rally the populace and the army alike. The Gordian line, though cut short in Africa, continued to influence the course of imperial politics, as the child Gordian III became the heir of senatorial hopes and the eventual solution to the crisis unleashed by Maximinus. The military situation, however, remained dire. Maximinus, enraged by the rebellion and the Senate's defiance, marched on Italy with his army, determined to crush his enemies. The Senate's decision to honor the Gordians and continue their defiance placed Rome directly in the path of civil war. As Maximinus advanced, the Senate and the people of Italy prepared for defense. Cities fortified their walls, militias were raised, and the memory of the Gordians was invoked as a justification for resistance. At the same time, propaganda spread throughout the empire, depicting Maximinus as a monstrous tyrant and the Gordians as martyrs of freedom. Coins minted in their honor circulated, bearing their names and images, reinforcing their symbolic role. Even though their reign had lasted a mere 22 days, their political afterlife endured, shaping the actions of those who followed. The psychological impact of the Gordians' fall was enormous. Their story revealed that even the wealthiest aristocrats could not hope to survive against the might of a professional legion, but it also revealed the willingness of the Senate to stake everything in opposition to a ruler they despised. The Gordians had been chosen not because they were mighty generals or hardened warriors, but because they represented an idea, the idea that Rome could still be governed by its traditional elite. Their deaths did not extinguish that idea, but instead sanctified it, giving the Senate martyrs to invoke as they carried on the struggle. In later accounts, the Gordians were remembered not for their brief administrative acts. There had been no time for reforms, no opportunity for policy, but for their symbolic role in the confrontation between the Senate and the military power of the emperors. They became part of the mythology of the crisis of the 3rd century. Their names invoked whenever aristocrats sought to assert their dignity against the encroaching dominance of the army. As the war against Maximinus continued, the Senate's gamble seemed perilous. Yet the Gordian legacy proved useful in maintaining unity. Papinus and Balbinus struggled to assert authority, facing opposition from the Roman mob and suspicion from the Praetorian Guard. But the presence of Gordian III, the young heir of the fallen family, gave their regime a measure of popular legitimacy. The people of Rome, who had celebrated Gordian I and II so enthusiastically, now transferred their affections to the boy, seeing in him a continuation of their noble line. Thus, even though the Gordians themselves were gone, their influence endured in the figure of their descendant. In this way, the rebellion of 238 CE, though seemingly a failure, paved the way for Gordian, the third's eventual rise to the throne, linking the senatorial revolt to the restoration of imperial continuity. The larger significance of the Gordians' story lies in what it reveals about the dynamics of power in the 3rd century. Their rapid rise and fall demonstrated the volatility of the empire, where emperors could be proclaimed one week and dead the next. Their reliance on local landowners and militias underscored the inadequacy of senatorial power when divorced from military strength. Their deaths illustrated the ruthless efficiency of loyal legions in crushing rebellion. And yet, their symbolic importance showed that legitimacy in Rome was not solely about force. It was also about perception, heritage, and the ability to embody the values cherished by different constituencies. For the Senate, the Gordians were proof that aristocrats still mattered. For the people, they were proof that emperors could emerge from noble, cultured families rather than the rough camps of the army. For Maximinus, they were traitors whose rebellion justified harsher measures. For historians, they stand as examples of the fragility of imperial power and the dangers of rebellion in a militarized empire. Even centuries later, the Gordian story was retold with fascination. Raiders like Herodian and the authors of the Historia Augusta depicted them as tragic figures, noblemen swept into a role they neither sought nor could sustain, their deaths lamented as the consequence of tyranny and military dominance. Their brief reign became emblematic of the crisis of the 3rd century, a period when emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, when legitimacy was fragile, and when Rome itself teetered on the brink of collapse. The Gordians' 22 days in power were not forgotten, because in those days, the Senate had dared to act, dared to proclaim its will, and dared to resist the soldier emperor who mocked its authority. Their failure was tragic, but their defiance was remembered, giving them a place in the long and tumultuous history of Rome's imperial struggle. The story of Gordian III, the youngest emperor in Roman history up to that time, begins in the aftermath of one of the most turbulent years the Roman Empire had ever seen, the year of the 6 emperors in 238 CE. It was during this period of chaos, rebellion, and shifting loyalties that a mere boy, not yet 15 years old, would ascend to the most powerful throne in the ancient world. Gordian III's reign reflects both the desperation of the Roman elite to find stability and the vulnerability of a child emperor caught in the political machinations of generals, senators, and ambitious rivals. His life, though brief, is a window into the instability of the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. Gordian III was born Marcus Antonius Gorgianus in 225 CE, the grandson of Gordian I and the nephew of Gordian II. His family was part of the senatorial aristocracy, connected to Rome's wealth and traditions, though not initially among the most prominent dynasties of the empire. When Gordian I and II were briefly proclaimed emperors in Africa, during the revolt against Maximinus Thrax in 238 CE, their revolt ended in tragedy, with both men dead within a month. But their bloodline would live on through young Gordian, who would later become the last hope for stability after the bloody chaos of that year. The Roman Senate, desperate to find a figure around whom the population could rally, elevated Perpinus and Balbinus as joint emperors in 238 CE after the deaths of Gordian I and II. However, neither man was popular. Perpinus, a stern military commander, was distrusted by the urban population and the Praetorian Guard, while Balbinus was seen as weak and indecisive. Rome was in danger of tearing itself apart, as Maximinus Thrax was still alive and marching toward Italy, and the citizens in the capital rioted, unhappy with the Senate's choices. In the midst of this chaos, the people demanded a symbolic figure who could unite them, someone connected to the beloved but short-lived Gordian dynasty. Thus, the Senate proclaimed the young Gordian III as Caesar, a junior emperor, alongside Perpinus and Balbinus. Though still a boy of about 13 years old, his youth and lineage made him an acceptable compromise. He represented continuity with Gordian I and II, who were regarded as martyrs against the hated Maximinus. His very presence softened the harshness of Perpinus and Balbinus's rule, giving the people someone they could cheer for. In truth, Gordian had no power at this point. He was a puppet, a symbol of legitimacy, while the real power remained in the hands of older men. The situation soon escalated. Maximinus Thrax, still determined to crush the Senate's rebellion, marched on Italy. The city of Aquileia resisted his siege, and the starving soldiers of Maximinus, disillusioned with their commander, mutinied and killed him. With Maximinus gone, Rome breathed a sigh of relief, but peace did not last. Papinius and Balbinus fell into bitter conflict with each other, and the Praetorian Guard, who felt excluded and insulted by the Senate's choices, stormed the palace and murdered both emperors in the summer of 238 CE. At just 13 years old, Gordian III was left as the sole emperor of Rome. His rise marked both hope and tragedy. Hope because he was young enough to be shaped by good advisors. Tragedy because his youth made him vulnerable to manipulation. Once emperor, Gordian III relied heavily on a circle of senior advisors. His most important supporter was the powerful Timesitheus, a distinguished statesman and Praetorian prefect who became a mentor and father figure to the boy. Under Timesitheus' guidance, the empire enjoyed a period of relative stability. The early years of Gordian's reign were overshadowed by external threats, particularly from the east. In Persia, the new Sassanid dynasty under Shapur I sought to expand into Roman territory. Shapur was no ordinary rival. He was a determined and ambitious king who envisioned a Persian resurgence at Rome's expense. By 240 CE, Shapur invaded Mesopotamia, capturing important Roman cities and threatening Syria. The crisis demanded a strong response, and although Gordian was still only a teenager, the empire rallied to his banner, seeing him as a figure who could lead Rome against the Persian threat. In 241 CE, Gordian married the daughter of Timesitheus, cementing his bond with his trusted advisor. This marriage strengthened the alliance between emperor and prefect, ensuring that Timesitheus' influence remained unchallenged. It also showed how much Rome depended on Timesitheus' wisdom, for the entire empire's stability rested on his shoulders. The campaign against Persia began in earnest in 242 CE. Gordian, though still only 17, personally accompanied the Roman army to the east, a remarkable demonstration of imperial duty for one so young. The Roman troops, inspired by the emperor's presence, marched with confidence. Under Timesitheus' organization, the Romans won several victories, pushing Shapur's forces back across Mesopotamia. The capture of important cities boosted Roman morale, and for a time, it seemed that Gordian's reign might become one of revival. But fate soon intervened. In 243 CE, during the campaign, Timesitheus fell ill and died suddenly. His death was a devastating blow, not only to Gordian personally, who lost his mentor and father-in-law, but also to the stability of the Roman command structure. In the vacuum left by Timesitheus' death, another man rose to prominence, Marcus Julius Philippus, known to history as Philip the Arab. Philip was ambitious and shrewd. With Gordian still young and inexperienced, Philip positioned himself as the new Praetorian prefect and gradually took control of the army. He managed to secure the loyalty of many officers, subtly undermining Gordian's authority. The following year, in 244 CE, the Roman army faced Shapur again near Ctesiphon. Accounts of what happened next are confused, as Roman and Persian sources contradict one another. According to Roman propaganda, the battle was difficult, but not disastrous. Yet Shapur's inscriptions claim that he inflicted a crushing defeat on the Romans, forcing them to retreat. What is certain is that Gordian did not survive. At only 19 years old, Gordian III died under mysterious circumstances during the Persian campaign. Some sources suggest he was killed in battle, perhaps trampled by his own panicked soldiers. Others claim he was assassinated on Philip's orders, who then declared himself emperor. Shapur, for his part, boasted that Gordian had been killed in battle and erected a relief at Nakshi Rustam, showing the young emperor's death. Gordian's death marked the end of Rome's last attempt at youthful hope during this period. The Senate mourned him, for he had been a symbol of legitimacy and continuity, but his reign was ultimately short and tragic. He was deified by the Senate, remembered as a young emperor who tried to serve Rome, but was undone by the turbulence of his times. The reign of Gordian III highlights several themes of the crisis of the 3rd century. First, the empire desperately sought stability, often placing power in the hands of figureheads who could unite the people. Second, external threats from Persia and barbarian tribes made military strength essential, but the internal weakness of Rome's leadership often undermined campaigns. Third, the reliance on powerful advisors like Timesitheus and Philip showed that the real power often rested not with the emperor, but with those who controlled the armies and administration. Though Gordian III was young and inexperienced, his presence on the throne showed how much Rome longed for legitimacy after the chaos of 238 CE. His death, shrouded in suspicion and controversy, was another reminder of how fragile the empire had become. In many ways, Gordian III's reign was a tragedy of potential unfulfilled. He had begun to grow into his role under Timesitheus' guidance, and his marriage tied him to Rome's most capable leader. Had Timesitheus lived longer, Gordian's reign might have ushered in stability and perhaps delayed the empire's long decline. Instead, his death handed power to Philip the Arab and continued the cycle of short-lived emperors and shifting allegiances that defined the 3rd century. The image of Gordian remains striking: a boy thrust into the throne of Rome, carried to the front lines of a war with Persia, and cut down before he could truly rule. His reign, though short, is a powerful story of how youth and hope were swallowed by the brutal realities of Rome's military and political struggles.